So welcome folks to the Attleboro Area Industrial Museum. This is our new speaker series, and today you are in for a treat. We have Mr. David Setterland, automobile historian, been in the auto transportation business his whole life, and he's going to give you the history of automobile manufacturing right here in Massachusetts and southern Rhode Island, and probably the whole world if I know David. And he's going to speak. He'll answer your questions. He's got some great photos and some custom-made drawings and paintings, and he's going to even tell you about a gentleman by the name of Frank Mossberg. If you know anything about Attleboro's history, you know he's quite a guy. So Dave, welcome.
Thank you, Carleton. Okay, I'm going to change it a little bit than what you're told you're going to hear, because basically there was only 3 cars that I think is really important built in Rhode Island. That was the Cameron. Jonathan Maxwell had 2 plants, and the Elko, American Locomotive Company. But before we get into cars, I was hoping that there'd be some younger people here that we could educate on where we came from in America. And I don't really like reading things, but I think it's going to be a little bit quicker if I read these to you. So, and how it eventually led to the successful automobile industry. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution. And it's centered between Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. When you hear the pioneers and what they accomplished, then you know that you're right in the melting pot of the Industrial Revolution here. To tell the whole story of the Industrial Revolution, one must start in the beginning. England is credited with the true start of industry becoming more of a movement from hand labor to the manufactured goods using machines. The key invention was a steam engine to power factories, forms of transportation, and after to generate electricity that is regarded as the second era of the Industrial Revolution. We're only going to talk about the first area here. Life before Industrial Revolution started. The newly formed United States of America won the independence from England by winning the Revolutionary War led by George Washington with a lot of aid and help from France and the Marquis de Lafayette. Most men farmed, growing their own food and taking care of livestock. So you're talking 1783, there was really no transportation system. If you wanted to travel from one place to another, it was going to take you days, and you had to have a horse, or you had to pay somebody to take you. Most of the transportation was done right along the coast. You had to catch a clipper ship or a ferry. So 85% of the population in 1783 were farmers. They didn't travel anyplace. The other 15% worked in the cities or the main towns. And what they did is they brought those imports in from India and China, and the King of England taxed them. So the city dwellers worked in stores and with limited opportunities. Stores sold mostly imports from Europe and England. By 1783, Levi Pease of Shrewsbury, he used to go and get horses for George Washington in the Revolutionary War. He was a blacksmith that lived in Shrewsbury, and he bought a house on National Road east of Worcester. His house was for travelers to stay at night. He decided to start a coach service from Boston to Hartford, with the first stage ending in Spencer, Massachusetts, just west of Worcester. Next, it was on to Hartford, Connecticut, and eventually traveling 2 more stages from Hartford Stagecoach Line, boarded Hartford to Stratford Ferry, Connecticut, then on to New York City. People who took this stagecoach line boarded at the Boston Inn opposite Boston Common in downtown Boston, riding the first day or stage of the trip to possibly Shrewsbury to stay in Pease's Tavern and Inn. The next morning, they would arrive in Spencer, swapping into the arriving stagecoach from Hartford. And the eastbound travelers swapped in a stagecoach that just arrived from Boston that day before. The cost was 4 pence per mile. Once Pease got the government mail contracts from Boston and New York City, he lowered the cost to 3 pence a mile. Travelers were permitted to carry 14 pounds of luggage. If heavier, they paid extra fare. Pease's stagecoach business caught on, and soon the stagecoach line opened up, advertising a stagecoach line from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Savannah, Georgia in 1786. Most likely, this route was carrying supplies from the north to the south and bringing cotton back to the north. The horses pulling these coaches usually were swapped out within 18 miles from where they started. Through hills or mountains, the horses had to be rested and swapped more frequently. Ferry boats plying the coastal waters and using the typical three-masted schooners was the alternative way to travel. With Boston more or less being the center of commerce, with New York following in the 19th century, Boston started 3 railroad lines: Boston to Providence, Boston to Worcester, and Boston to Portland. The first of these 3 trains started in 1835. 1838, Pennsylvania followed suit, building railroad lines to move their forestry and coal products. The very first train in America was built in Quincy to carry the huge blocks of granite that were used as the base blocks for the Bunker Hill Monument. They weighed 12,000 pounds. They built this rail from West Quincy right to East Milton Square down the Neponset River. Then they loaded them onto the boats and brought them over to Charlestown, and then they brought them up. Today, there is a monument in East Milton Square marking the spot. Modernization of times has removed all of the original rail line. The granite blocks used on the Bunker Hill Monument were the first granite blocks transported out of West Quincy. The use of granite blocks was also used in building many of America's lighthouses, lining the coast to warn and guide ships safely into harbors. Phase 1, the 2 most important men credited with bringing the new knowledge to America and the start of the Revolution from slave and child labor should be credited to Samuel Slater and later Francis Cabot Lowell. Slater came from England to the States in 1793. In England, he had worked in some of the mills, and he remembered how the machines were made and made drawings. When Slater arrived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, he worked at a mill on the Blackstone River. It was Samuel Slater who introduced the machinery in that mill to make production of cloth and other items by machinery than by hand. Even after Slater helped the mills to conform to use of machinery, many mills still use child labor and the use of slavery in the North. In Pawtucket, the national government has acknowledged the importance of the Slater Mill as a historic site and declared the whole Blackstone River as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Then, a decade later, came Francis Cabot Lowell, born April 7, 1775 in Newburyport, Mass. Just before America got their independence, graduate of Phillips Academy of Andover and Harvard College of Cambridge, he took to work in a cargo clipper from Spain and France. Staying a year in France and learning about the country, came back when Napoleon made the country unsafe. Returning to Boston in 1802, his father, John Lowell, passed away, leaving a good inheritance. With the money, he bought 8 cargo ships to import silks, tea, and textile goods from China and India. He had set up shop on Long Wharf and built many of the long warehouses, including India Wharf in 1814. He partnered with a Mr. Thorndike, who was considered one of the wealthiest men of the new country with many political ties. Thorndike was also known to have made lots of money in both the slave trade as well as cargo from China. Thorndike is the 4th-generation grandfather to John Kerry, the senator. Thorndike is considered one of the wealthiest men in America when living and rating in the top 50 of all-time wealthiest men to the history. Once Francis Lowell passed away on August 10, 1817, Thorndike took over the Boston manufacturing. Boston manufacturing was actually started on Charles River in 1803, I believe, or 1810, in Waltham. And the town, Francis Lowell, had visited Scotland and visited the mills making cotton fabrics. He visualized how the machines were made, and on his return had duplicates built. Lowell is considered one of the most important of all men in getting the Industrial Revolution started here in America. The city of Lowell was named after Francis Cabot Lowell, and also has a national park in the mill buildings lining the Merrimack River. Now, if you've never visited Lowell National Park, I suggest you to do it, because it teaches you how plaids like this are formed. They use bobbins, and it's kind of neat. This thread will go this way, and then it'll skip 2 or 3, then another one, and then back. And that's the way they made with the machine, where before it was always made by hand, and most people didn't spend a lot of time and money making clothes. Next comes Eli Whitney, born December 8, 1765 in Westborough, Mass. Whitney graduated from Yale University, but before he went to Yale University, he used to hang out in his father's tool shed. And he figured, if I don't go get an education, I'm going to be a farmer for the rest of my life. So he went to Yale University. When he graduated, he tried to get 2 different jobs teaching, and nobody would hire him. So the president of Yale told General Greene's wife down in South Carolina that he would be an excellent tutor for their children. So he traveled down to South Carolina, and that's where he learned that the cotton, they had 2 different types of cotton. One had green seeds and one had black seeds. And it took a slave 11 hours and 20 minutes to get 1 pound of pure cotton by pulling out the seeds. So what he did is he took a cylinder about this big, and he had it like a chute going in, and they would push the cotton in to that cylinder. That cylinder was going around and around, and it was by hand that you make it move. And there was wires that would come out and it would rip the cotton away, and any seeds would fall down. But the strands of cotton, after you have that full, then they would take and push the rubbish away and put a new one in, and then they would put another cylinder inside with brushes, and it would reverse the opposite way, pulling the cotton strands off of the wires and drop. But that's not the most important thing that Eli Whitney invented. He sued because all the people in South Carolina started making them own. When he took out a patent, they didn't want to acknowledge it. So he sued the state for $100,000. South Carolina gave him $50,000, and North Carolina agreed to $40,000. And he came back to Massachusetts, and he took and he invented the milling machine, but he didn't get a patent on it. So Frederick Webster Howe, born on August 28, 1822, improved on the Eli Whitney milling machine. He also worked for Brown and Sharp, and he became the president. And he improved on Thomas Blanchard's lathe, and between those two, they brought him to the Springfield Armory, and now they could make the best weapons with interchangeable parts, all precision made. So Thomas Blanchard, he also built in 1826, Thomas built a steam wagon, and there was a Mr. Roper in Duxbury that built one in 1841. But they don't really consider that as the first automobiles because they didn't have any history or take pictures or push to do it. Next, we may see pioneer inventors fulfilling the needs for tools to simply make the job easier. 1831, Cyrus McCormick. He used a pulley and a tractor or a horse, invents a crop reaper to harvest crops. 1837, John Deere, Vermont native, designs and makes the first steel plows. Plows were used to be pulled by horses with a sharp plow blade digging into the ground and turning it over, leaving it ready to plant the crop. 1844, Samuel Morse invented the first telegraph machines to send long-distance messages over the wire, also developed the Morse code for communicating across the water from one ship to another. 1844, Charles Goodyear experiments in vulcanizing rubber, with the rubber now capable of being used without breaking down, making the rubber hard for many uses as well as becoming pliable to form in certain shapes. 1846, Isaiah Howe is credited with building the first sewing machine, but will be improved on many more times. Thomas White and Mr. Grout of Orange, Massachusetts started a sewing machine company, and both went their separate ways, with White manufacturing his White sewing machine in Cleveland, and Grout started New Home Sewing Machine Company in Orange, Mass. Both these men had 3 sons each that separately started building powered automobiles when they got into their teens. The White steam car of Cleveland and the Grout steam car of Orange, Mass. 1853, Eliza Otis developed a braking system to use in elevators to use safely. Without a safe way of slowing an elevator down, they were useless. 1860s, George Brayton from Compton, Rhode Island, he helped build the Kohler steam engine, which took 3 train cars to transport it down to the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 in Philadelphia. But he also built the first the very first internal combustion engine known in America. And what he did is, you had a Governor Sprague that paid him to take and put this steam engine on a tram in Olneyville and go up over Westminster Hill to downtown Providence. And this very fact, his wife testified in a court hearing for Henry Ford to beat George Selden in that patent case. So George Brayton, he started the Ready engine and he had them on this display down there. And when he did, you had Gottlieb Daimler, Wilhelm Maybach. They both came over and bought one and they brought them back to Europe and he actually improved on them and he used them. Wilhelm Maybach made what they called the silent auto engine because his first engines were bought from Nicholas Otto that started building engines after Etienne Lenoir had built the first one supposedly in France, but there was actually more. And my good friend Dean here sent me information that I didn't even know there was actually French internal combustion engine before them. So, okay, Alexander Graham Bell experimented with first successful use of a wire in telephones. In Boston was Mr. Watson, and Bell was in Cambridge when the first telephone call was accomplished. 1898, first roller coaster designed by Edwin Prescott. The feat might be considered the first experiment in having recreation time for the family. 1903, first flight by Orville and Wilbur Wright. Kitty Hawk, North Dakota. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. I don't know where North Dakota came. Even though very little metal parts were used in the first experimental plane, but led very quickly within a decade to numerous advances in airplanes and safety. One gentleman in Kentucky claims he built a functional airplane that flew successfully into Kentucky a few years before the Wrights. Going back to the most important of all is the railroad system that started in the 1840s. It gave future American industries the capabilities to ship their goods all around the country, as well as buying the parts or raw materials needed for their manufacturing. U.S. government built canals and roadways and connecting the railroad cities with the goods needed to survive. Thomas Edison, becoming the best and most important inventor through the industrial age. The Industrial Revolution was started with Edison lighting up America. He never attended college. He lost his hearing at a young age. I heard a story that a teacher went up to him because he was just in a trance, and they clapped their hands on his ears and they popped his eardrums. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was deaf completely one ear and barely could hear out of this ear. And the story from Chester Vanderpyle, which is Frank Mossberg's grandson, said that when he came here, Thomas Edison, he used the trumpet horn, and he would hold it up, and you spoke into the trumpet, and then Thomas Edison could hear. Nikola Tesla, schooled in Austria, was working for Edison when arriving. He was working at the Paris Edison plant. When he got transferred to the United States and promoted alternating current against Edison direct current, it caused a little rift and they separated. A lot of people, they don't give Nikola Tesla the true credit because he had had 6 years of schooling, and quite honestly, the Austrians are farther ahead than we were here. The Wright brothers building the first airplane and continuously making it more feasible for safe air. George Westinghouse built with a railroad car braking system, then steam tractors, and finally Westinghouse Electric making transformers to pass alternating current electricity to be transferred long distances. Direct current cannot go long distances. You lose the power of the electricity. But the alternating current, you can. Okay, now we're going to start with automobiles. There's a lot of claims that the oldest car is Carl Benz. It is not. This is a car, and my granddaughter will show you all this. You can pass it around if you want. This is a car built by Siegfried Marcus in Vienna, Austria in 1877. 10 years before that, he had built a steam car. So the Germans want to say, no, that this was a steam car. No, it was electric. I went and inspected it. It's in the Technical Museum in Austria. Fabulous museum. And what happened, here you go, you can show everybody. What happened is when Hitler came to power, he sent his soldiers to Vienna, and he told them, when they get there, go into the museum and destroy this, because they wanted the Germans to have credit for building the first automobile. Hitler even told Karl Benz that he couldn't spell his name with a C anymore, that the German way is K. So he had to, so anyways, the military went, and word got out to the men working in the museum that Hitler's army was going to destroy this car. So what they did is they built a cement block wall around it down in the basement, and they left it. But the war happened so long, the people that built the wall, they were no longer at the museum. And 20 some odd years later, somebody says, you know, there's got to be something behind that wall. You know, it doesn't make sense. So they tore down the wall, and here they found the Siegfried Marcus, the oldest car ever built. And it's mostly wood, including the steering wheel and everything else. Okay, now we're going to start with the program. Susie?
Okay. In 1891, John William Lambert of Mechanicsburg, Ohio, built the first internal combustion car ever built in the U.S. When he moved to Union, Ohio, he built the Union Locomobile. Followed and moved to Anderson, Indiana, and he changed the name to Lambert Automobile. World War I got U.S. government contracts, and they built the trucks thereafter, and they stopped building cars.
John William Lambert, when he was 14 years old, he told his father that he was interested in seeing an internal combustion engine. So his father took him the next day about 15 miles to a different town that had an auto engine performing. When they got there, the building had burnt down the night before, so John and his father took the engine apart to see how it was built, and that gave him the desire to build. He led so many different inventions about planting corn, building different equipment for the farming.
Approximately 1893, Charles and Frank Durrier from Peoria, Illinois to Washington, D.C. sold bicycles next to Springfield, Massachusetts, building gas-powered cars. They won the first auto race in America, Chicago to Joliet, Illinois, in a snowstorm. Frank built the race car, and a feud started between the two brothers. Frank stayed in Springfield, building the Stevens-Durrier automobile. Charles returned to Peoria, building cars before moving to Reading, Pennsylvania, and he built a few different makers. So once again, there was a jealousy between the brothers, as it happens in lots of families.
Charles Durrier actually saved Henry Ford because he's the one that researched. He went bankrupt, and he needed money, and he had a daughter in college. So he went to work for Henry Ford, because Durrier's actually built an automobile that drove before that patent was accepted for the Selden patent. So what happened is, Charles Durrier, after the race, he was talking to all the reporters, telling them about the car that he built, and Frank didn't like it because Frank was the one that built the car. So to make a long story short, state of Massachusetts decided to honor Charles Durrier with a monument next to the State House. And it stayed there for approximately 6 months, and it disappeared. And I inquired, you know, do they have any idea who took it? Well, Frank Durrier, he, you know, continued building cars with different companies in Springfield, and he retired down on the south central coast. He lived to be 90 some odd years old. Next one.
In 1894, Elwood Haynes of Kokomo, Indiana, built the Pioneer 1, hiring the Asperson brothers, Elmer and Edgar Asperson, and Jonathan Maxwell, to build the first car in Indiana and a third auto in the U.S. with internal combustion engine. bought Stint's boat engine 1 cylinder with a chain drive and tiller steering. Haynes was responsible for invented stainless steel. That he sold out of patents to become U.S. Stainless Steel Company. He also was a
Metallurgist?
metallurgist,
Yes.
corporate metal, invented the stellite, selling out with Union Carbide before coming a new company. He was schooled in Worcester Polytech and with his father, Southbridge, and grandfather Monson, born in Massachusetts, who was against alcohol and supported women that were abused by drunken husbands.
Elwood Haynes and he bought a Since engine from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he brought it into his kitchen and he hooked it up, and when he connected the battery to start it, he didn't secure it, and the torque of the engine started bouncing everywhere, destroying cabinets. He had no muffler to run the exhaust fumes out. He filled the kitchen. His wife started yelling at him, "Elwood, get that thing out of the house now." And they called the fire department, which is you pull the fire apparatus. And when he ran in that same race that Duryea won, the one thing that Duryea did, there was a snowstorm before the night of the race, before the race started. So Duryea took pieces of cloth, like t-shirts, and he cut them in ribbons and he tied them around the wheels so he would have traction on the ice and snow. Duryea was driving, and he wasn't a very good winter driver because he slid off the road and basically bent the wheels so he could not race in the race. But Elwood Haynes, when I was in the house, I talked to the curator for 3 hours and I asked him, what can you tell me that Elwood, that people don't know about Elwood that you do by reading and researching everything? And he's told how he was sick to his stomach about men drinking too much and then abusing their wife and children. So he spent well over $1 million in that late 1890s and early 1900s helping them move out of the house and have them in a safe home until the husbands either cleaned up their act or, got divorced. He also had a tunnel over to his workshop. Now, I did point out that Jonathan Maxwell is a very important name with the Apperson brothers. The Apperson brothers owned a machine shop in Kokomo, Indiana, and they used to do any type of steel, fix-it, work that you needed in a machine shop. They hired Jonathan Maxwell. They were doing different farm equipment, fixing plows and stuff. And Elwood asked them if they would build the Pioneer 1. He showed the plans, and he told them he wanted tiller steer and chain drive. So they said, yeah, it would be 40 cents an hour after all our other work is done. So they ended up building it. Now, the Apperson brothers, you probably didn't hear of them, but the two brothers, the youngest one was 6 years old, and I don't have a picture of an Apperson car. But anyways, he was 6 years old, and his father took him hunting, and he gave him a rifle, and there's a rabbit, and he killed the rabbit. And he was happy, but the father started yelling at him and said, "What'd you do that for?" He says, "Now we can't eat it. It's filled with lead." He says, "When you shoot a rabbit, you got to shoot him between the eyes, and then we can eat him." So the weapon that he used was passed down from Daniel Boone to the Appersons' maternal grandmother. Now, we mentioned Jonathan Maxwell. He went to work from the Appersons to Oldsmobile. And when he got to Oldsmobile, he took and he met Charles King. So the two of them teamed up to build the Northern car. Now I'm going to show you the King car, but I want to tell you a little bit about Charles King. He built the very first automobile in Michigan, 30 days before Henry Ford. Henry Ford chased him on a bicycle down a Cadillac Square in the middle of the night. Charles King and Ford became very good friends, and Charles King was in the kitchen when Henry Ford built that first one-cylinder engine. That's per testimony of Charles King. He also, when he worked for the Michigan Car Company. In the 1896 Chicago exhibition, he won top prize because he invented pneumatic tools, the jackhammer and the rivet gun, using air. He also, when Ransom Olds was 80 years old, he thought that they should be all brought together at a dinner to honor the earliest pioneers. So he was the one that founded the Detroit Automobile Hall of Fame. The Northern car, Jonathan Briscoe met Jonathan Maxwell, and he told him that he wanted to take him and have him build a car called the Maxwell. So King and Maxwell split up. King went to France and studied the automobile construction and designs, and he came back and he started to build his own car, the King automobile. Charles King was born in Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. His father was a general in the Civil War, and that became the Ellis Island. He was a doctor. That became the Ellis Island of the West Coast. So the ships coming in from Asia had to stop at Angel Island, and his father would go on and he would test to make sure that none of them had diseases, and if they did, he sent the whole ship back. If they didn't, he allowed them to land in the port. Charles King also ended up living on the South Connecticut shoreline, right opposite Walter Chrysler's from Long Island. This is a King car. What was that last picture? Oh, that's a Maxwell that I just showed. This is the King car.
Around 1896, Ransom Eli Olds of Lansing, Michigan, had built steam cars in a steamboat on the Lansing River when he was only 16 years old. By 1896, he had built his first gasoline internal combustion engine powered automobile. He was born in Ohio, and his father moved to Lansing, opening up a machine shop. Olds' first car was the curved-dash one-cylinder lightweight auto. Ransom soon after needed to expand and sold stock to the Smith family, who were lumber dealers owning a lot of acres of cutting trees for wood and building railroad cars for the Michigan Railroad Car Company that Charles King had worked for. Smith insisted his sons be the highest officers in the company. Soon Ransom left and sold his shares, starting his own company in 1904, naming it REO. Most have heard of it from the music group named the REO Speedwagon. Olds was into many facets of business, being banking, real estate, and finally building better cars and heavy-duty trucks. His one idea was brilliant for his wife, who could not get in the back of the automobile. He designed a Lazy Susan in the garage so she could drive in and out, pushing on the bar and turning the Lazy Susan 180 degrees until the car was headed out. Ransom Eli Olds is considered by many as a self-taught and one of the most important of the pioneers. Charles King wanted to have a dinner party of all the pioneers there to celebrate his 80th birthday. My name happens to be Susan, but I'm not a lazy Susan.
Ransom Olds, that boat, steam-powered boat that he built, that he would take couples up the Lansing River on a Friday and Saturday night in the good weather to make money. He sold that to a British company because they were going to take and duplicate it. So they shipped it to India, and sadly, the ship bringing it to India sank before it got to India. So his steamboat is no longer there.
In 1897, Alexander Winton of Cleveland, Ohio. Winton was the first in getting autos built to sell to the public. A man with a short fuse sold one to Billy and James Packard, and with that, Winton broke down before James got it home. He had it towed home with Alexander coming the 80 miles to fix it. Packard's suggestions got Winton mad, and Winton told Packard, "If you know so much about automobiles, why don't you just build your own?" So Packard Automobiles was soon born. Winton did build quite a nice automobile after a few kinks were worked out, and became the fastest race driver, but only losing to Henry Ford in his race car that was numbered 999. Winton had married 3 different times. His first wife was a sleepwalker, and one night walked out the back door and off a 150-foot cliff to her death. She left 7 children. Alexander asked his mother-in-law and sister-in-law to come live with them and help take care of them. He soon after married his first wife's sister and they had a child. She died years later, and a few years before Alexander died, he married an actress that performed in plays, half of the age of Alexander. Once attending a play with real live Native American Indian chief, she said how much she loved the chief. This caused Alexander to get mad, fight with her, divorce her, and settle for $200,000. That was a lot of money back then. And she ended up marrying a Native American chief.
Winton ended up making boats for World War I, marine engines, and he sold that to General Motors. General Motors bought it, and they continued on. The Winton, he came from Scotland. Susie and I went to Scotland. We visited David Buick's hometown and Alexander Winton. Packard is next.
In 1899, the Packard brothers, James and William, started in 1898 to build their own car after Winton suggested it. The Packard brothers owned an electric parts manufacturing company in Warren, Ohio. The first Packard completed was a success, and soon the company was producing, unable to keep up with all the orders. Mr. Joy, who first saw a Packard racing after a fire engine in New York City at one of the first car shows in the hotel, waited and once returned to the showroom. Joy approached and bought the automobile. Eventually he bought stock in Packard with other voters, had it moved to Detroit for manufacturing to be more efficient. The Packard brothers, who started the company after a while, sold out with one being on the board of directors. Mr. Joy was the man behind building the most efficient and beautiful cars, the name Packard.
Yes.
1900, Charles Eckhart changed from building horse carriages to Auburn automobiles in Auburn, Indiana. Auburn has a great long history from it being sold to the Wrigley brothers, who owned Wrigley Gum Company. They were over their head not knowing how to sell the 400-plus cars stockpiled in the grounds behind the factory. Finally, having Eric Logan Ford taken over and repainting the cars bright colors with chrome, they all sold out with Ford taking over the Auburn Motor Company by a pre-agreement if he could sell them all. In time, Ford added the Duesenberg and started building an automobile named after himself. The L-29 Ford was considered one of the first front-wheel drive cars in America.
Eric Robin Cord hated his name. Eric was the name of the minister that married his mother and father, and Robin was his mother's maiden name. He actually grew up in California for a while when he was a teenager, and he used to take old Model T Fords, and he would take them, fix them up, put new fenders, because he could buy new fenders for $2 a piece, and he would take the old ones, fix them up, and he'd sell them. The problem with the early Fords and a lot of other early cars is the steel was not that good, and over a bumpy dirt road, you're going to get cracks and breaks.
1900, Roland White of Cleveland, Ohio, who had moved from Templeton, Massachusetts a few years before, was the son of Thomas White, who was the second largest manufacturer of sewing machines. Roland, as a teenager, bought a steam car. It did not run efficiently. By 1900, Roland designed a new flashpoint boiler similar to the French flashpoint boilers, and went into business with his two brothers and father backing him. The first presidential car in the White House was a white steam car in the Heritage Museum in Sandwich. It was during the Taft administration Roland had many inventions, including the tracks for tractors to work through mud and sand without getting stuck. The Clee-track tractors he started, as well as the new gasoline-powered car, named the Roland. And how many of you here have been to Heritage Plantation?
Excellent.
If you have not, I really suggest highly that you take a trip down. You can go online, and most libraries and places have free passes. And really, they have a very, very nice collection of cars, and it's a great place to just relax and walk around.
The one thing that Roland White did, I got a book from his granddaughter, and she lists all the inventions. If you watch a Jay Leno and you type in White Steamer, she gave him one too, so I feel pretty privileged. But anyways, he went to Lanai, Hawaii. His brother owned a large tract of pineapple plantation where Dole's is. And he said to his brother, because Roland was actually worn out, he was just dead. He wanted to take a break and recover. So his brother says, well, when you get back to work, he says, would you invent a tractor that doesn't get stuck in the sand? So he come out with a company called the Clee Track. And that has the bulldozer-like track. And it became a very big company. No matter what Roland White did, he succeeded. Now this is, oh, you're gonna read?
No.
This is a Knox company.
In 1900, the Knox Automobile Company of Springfield, Massachusetts starts building autos designed by Harry Knox, who had built steam cars for the Overman Wheel Company and worked with Frank Duryea during the Duryea when attending Springfield Vocational High School. Harry designed a unique engine called the Porcupine engine. It was air-cooled, but interestingly had brass rods sticking out of the engine block in an effort to help keep it cool. Holes drilled in the block had brass rods that screwed up in the engine block. One of the early Knox cars is on display at the Heritage Museum, also in Sandwich. The Knox auto year after year improved, and by 1908, they were using 4-cylinder engines to power the large touring cars. Knox had an Irish mechanic who invented the tractor and trailer as we know of it today. He used a tractor built by Knox and hooked up a fifth wheel with a pin lock. It became one of the most important inventions of the day, especially for the trash collectors who picked up trash in trucks and spent a long time shoveling out the landfill. Now they could just crank down the landing gear in the front and pull the fifth wheel pin and leave in place and hook up one already empty. In 1908, Harry left the company and started the Atlas Automobile Company, and just before World War I, Harry Knox invented the drive tracks for military tanks. For Knox Company, they went out of business in 1914. After an interesting decade and half of creating useful cars, tractor with fifth wheel, and became one of the first companies to build what we call a fire engine on a truck chassis.
Charles Martin was that Irish guy, and he started a company building a scooter-type automobile. And the Dean, what is the name of that race that's not a race with the old cars every year? He was born in Lowell, Mass. Somebody should know it.
Yeah, born by Hemmings, Great American Race.
No, this is, he dates back to 1918.
Yeah. Went around New England.
No, they did it.
The Glidden tour? Or was that
Pardon me?
Not the Glidden.
Yeah, the Glidden tour. Glidden became the president of that company that Charles Martin started. And the interesting thing, even with a big name like that, they never even sold one unit.
George Pierce?
Yep.
1901, George Pierce Company of Buffalo, New York, switched from building bird cages. Well, that's quite an interesting thing. Bird cages to automobiles. It was called the Motorette. It looked more like a horse-drawn carriage without the horses, similar to many of the 1890s developed autos. By 1902, the company started building motorcycles, the same as the Thomas Company of Buffalo. Pierce built 1- and 2-cylinder cars, but by 1904 they built a 4-cylinder and added the name Arrow to become the Pierce Arrow. The following year, when they built a large 6-cylinder, they added the name Pierce Great Arrow. Pierce Arrow at the time was regarded as one of the most beautiful and luxurious cars built.
Albert Kahn was the architect and designer of the Pierce Arrow plant. And what he did is he made, it was an industrial building, and he had skylights that could open up and let the heat out, and he also had light coming in and lighten it up. So the different the different workers in the factory didn't have to breathe in. They probably all smoked anyways, and then you had, the oil smoke from the machines working. The next one?
The Clark family in 1901, Charles, son Louis, John, and James of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, started building the Pittsburgh car. They were members of the Fish and Game Club that had not done maintenance on the dam that broke and flooded Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The liability for the mistake was huge, and quite possible the Clark family moved almost 300 miles to Ardmore, Pennsylvania, just 25 miles west of Philadelphia. Kobe Bryant, the basketball player, grew up there. The Clarks started again in 1901 building heavy-duty automobiles named Autocar. After the first decade, they stopped building cars and switched to heavy-duty trucks. Eventually, the Autocar manufacturing company was taken over by White Truck, division of the White Steam Car in Cleveland. Sometime in the 60s, the Autocar trucks were stopped being built.
The Autocar started making the trucks. But the most important thing that Autocar did was they found a different steel maker that made stronger steel than anybody else. And that steel, eventually, even Henry Ford had child Harold Wills work metallurgy and come up with a stronger steel too, because that was a problem with most of the cars. That's why you probably don't see that many, veteran cars from 1904, earlier. The next one is a combination of locomobile and Stanley steamer. Stanley steamer turns into locomobile, then it comes back to being Stanley steamer. You can read it.
1901 locomobile of Bridgeport, Connecticut, started by Amzie Barber of New York City. Barber made millions off paving asphalt streets in the city. The locomobile was bought by John Walker and Amzie Barber. The two could not agree, so Walker took his rights to build the steam vehicle, the Mobile, in Tarrytown, New York. Barber built his in Bridgeport. Just after a few years, Walker, who was connected to Cosmopolitan magazine, went out of business, and Barber's changed the steam to gasoline internal engines. Amzie sold the rights back to Stanley Brothers in Watertown, Massachusetts, for only $25,000. He had paid $250,000 for it just 3 years before. The locomobile became the most elegant of all cars, with the wealthy all wanting to own one.
Billy Durant, at the end of his career, he wanted to buy locomobile and a lot of the other more expensive makes like Mercer and whatnot, and the Crane Simplex. But there was something I wanted to tell you, and I can't think of it. But anyways, locomobile, they hired the very first woman automobile designer to do the interior. She went to France and she studied the French, how luxury they made the leathers and the curtains and everything, and locomobile followed.
1902, Thomas Jeffries and his son Charles built the best bicycles in America in Chicago, Illinois. Even Fred and Augie Duesenberg raced and sold Ramble bicycles made by the Jeffries. Thomas had come from England and had lots of experience in making the best items. Thomas died in Italy from a heart attack near Mount Vesuvius. Charles and his younger brother took over the company and changed the name to Jeffrey Automobile in honor of their father. Charles, on a trip to France to study the latest designs and improvements to cars, was on the Lusitania when the German shot one missile into the bow, with the ammunition inside being sneaked into England for the World War I epic. Charles' wife had bought Charles the best survival suit just in case it was to sink, like the Titanic. The ship was saved and returned home, telling his family he did not want to spend the rest of his life building automobiles in a warehouse, and he sold the company to Charles Nash in 1916.
In 1916, the Rambler or Jeffrey Company had just built the first four-wheel drive vehicle with all four wheels. And the interesting thing is you could unlock the back wheels and make them steering wheels. or unlock the front wheels and make them steering wheels. So it was a very interesting thing. I got to tell you, I went to the Kissel factory, and I met the grandson of Charles Nash, and I'll tell you that when we get to it.
In 1902, Henry Ford started designing an automobile for the second time to be built and named after himself. Ford cars were going to be the product name of the newly formed Detroit Automobile Company in Detroit, Michigan. Henry Ford was taking his time building the first car, but designing each part the best he could. He had one of the best engineers working with him named Charles Harold Wills. Wills stayed with Ford for about 16 years, making Ford a success. But a problem arose with the investors wanting Ford to get the cars built to sell so they could get a return on their investments. Ford was trying to make all the parts flawless before getting patents for them. If he just built the cars and sold them without trying to be perfect, someone else could buy a car, take it apart, and then go to the patent office and get the patent. This would mean Ford would have to pay royalties for parts that he invented. When the investors wanted to hire Henry Leland to take over building the cars while they told Ford to stay in his office and do the engineering, it upset Ford. Both Ford and Wills left the factory with other Ford loyalists. The next step was to ask Leland how much they could get for all the machinery. At that time, Leland Falconer Machine Shop was building engines and transmissions for Oldsmobile. Leland talked the investors into buying a new engine he started producing, much more powerful than a Ford engine. They decided to go with Leland, and the name had to be changed from Ford to the founder of Detroit, naming it Cadillac.
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of people say is they actually say that Ford copied the Cadillac, but it's just the opposite. Ford built the first Cadillac. He designed it and built it. Leland definitely made changes after that because it became a fantastic automobile. But the first Ford was built in 1903. But I did want to tell you a little bit about Henry Leland. He was born in Barton, Vermont. He was the 8th child out of 9 or 10. And his father named him Henry Martin Leland because he wanted him to know that Henry Martin was a missionary that came from England, went to Africa, and he died at a young age. But he was saintly, a good person, and very religious, and he wanted his son. And anybody that knows the history of Henry Leland knows how religious he was, always trying to do everything right. So once they lost their farm, because the father owned a farm, and when he owned the farm, this guy come up to him and says to him, you know, if you come up with $600, we can go in together and buy cattle because you have the grass and you make a lot of money. So he mortgaged the house for $600, gave the money to the thief, and he disappeared. So after that, to take and make the mortgage payments, Henry's father had to take him drive eight horses, pulling a wagon from Boston to Montreal. He got paid $1 a day. And he used to stop at the bar in a hotel near Barton, and he stayed there and he met the owner's daughter and he ended up marrying her. But he said that the one thing that he learned at a very young age is he took and he had to open the gate, the post, for the cows to come out of the pasture back to the barn, and he took it and he threw it. And his mother told him, you don't ever do that. You take the extra second and you do things right. Now, if you broke that, then it's going to cost more to fix it, or a cow, if they step on it, they could get hurt. So from the very earliest age, Henry Leland knew that he had to do everything perfect all the time. He moved to Grafton, Mass, and his brother joined the Civil War. He wanted to join the Civil War. His mother wouldn't let him. So he went to Springfield Arsenal, and he got a job running lathes and milling machines. He had already worked in the business of machinery anyways. He ended up at Brown and Sharp, being a salesman, traveling all over the country. And he ended up settling in Detroit, and he met Mr. Falconer, another lumber man with lots of money, and he started making the transmissions and engines, and eventually it led into him taking over. Oh, you want a break? Okay.
Well, I think everyone in here knows probably mostly information on Henry Ford. He's probably the best known car, manufacturer, builder. And many of you probably watched his PBS show. His documentary is quite good, and they did a wonderful job on it. So I think Dave knows everything about Henry Ford, rather than me read about
Okay,
the paper.
everybody in agreement, we'll skip over Ford?
I mean, reading the whole thing it's a lot, but I think you all know about Henry Ford. Maybe he can just add a tidbit or two to it, but
Well,
he's quite an interesting man.
yeah, real quick, everybody knows that he had the Dodge brothers supplying the chassis and the drivetrain, not the wheels and not the body. They would deliver it. 165 of them was the original contract. Ford owed them $7,000, and the stock was $100 each. So he gave them 70 shares of stock. In 1914, when he wanted to build the River Rouge plant, the Dodge brothers had already collected over $1 million in their dividends from those 70 shares. Well, actually, they bought 30 more, so it was 100 shares. They had made over $1 million, and they didn't want to build the River Rouge. They were happy getting their big dividend checks. So Henry Ford says to him, look, you're not going to hold the company back. We're going to build the River Rouge. If you don't want part of it, sell your stock. So he offered him, and the Dodge brothers took him to court and said, no, the stock is worth more than what he's saying. So after a year and a half of going in and seeing everything that Ford owned to come up, that each share of stock was worth $232,000, which meant the Dodge brothers got a check for $23,200,000 and some odd thousand. That's basically it. And Child Harold Wills, the engineer, he invented the vanadium. Is that the way they say it, vanadium or vanadium steel? And then he went to the molybdenum steel he invented. But he made the Ford logo. He did so much. And a lot of people think Henry Ford was the great inventor, but I think Mr. Wills was actually the person that deserves a lot of credit. Okay, Claude Cox was the next one. He was in Terre Haute, Indiana, going to college. And his senior paper was how to build an automobile. But he worked he worked for a wheel company. I don't see the name of it. But anyways, he worked for a wheel company, and the president of the wheel company took Mr. Cox out for lunch, and he says, well, what do you think, this paper, you said that you could build an automobile. He says, should we go in and build an automobile? And Mr. Cox says, yes. He says, but we can't use railroad tracks. It has to go overland. And the president says, wow, that's a good name, overland. So they started building it. And John North Willys owned a sporting goods shop in New York. And when they had that first Pan-American race from New York City to Buffalo, when President McKinley got assassinated, John Willys was in Syracuse watching those cars go by. And he started buying every car that Overland made. Well, after 2.5 years, Overland had a problem, and they were running out of money, so John Willys took over the company. And when he left that factory, he had to do something else, and he couldn't get a factory, so he set up 3 big circus tents in Indianapolis, and that's where they built the cars. Eventually, he got the Jeep contract, and you know the rest of the story on that. We're going to skip over. Oh, they did pay Walter Chrysler $1 million, the bankers, to save Willys from going out of business. And it took him 2 years to save the company. He closed the Elizabeth, New Jersey plant, and they started making a profit after 2 years. He made $2 million. So Walter Chrysler put an ad in. Anybody else that wants me to straighten out their company and save the company? He says it'll be $1 million a year. Jonathan Maxwell, the U.S. Motors company with Benjamin Briscoe, had faulted. So she can take him over, Faithy. The Model T and a Willys Overland. So Walter Chrysler made another $1 million. And he straightened out the Maxwell Company, and then the next year he ended up buying it. Colonel Albert Pope, the Pope Hartford. He was a Boston native, and he used to summer in Cohasset.
He first created a monopoly of bicycles in the 1880s, and once autos started getting popular, he opened 4 different factories building steam, electric, and gasoline-powered cars. The Pope Hartford Company was on the elite of automaking. He bought 80% of the Selden patent and trying to control other automakers from starting up. Once again, in the Heritage Museum, you can see a beautiful Pope Hartford on display. For many, it is one of their favorite automobiles.
Colonel Albert Pope started in Boston. As a 7-year-old, he walked out with his red wagon to a farmer and he bought vegetables off him, and then he walked the neighborhood selling them. He was born to sell and make money. This is a Thomas, Edwin Thomas.
Edwin Thomas, okay, who worked for his father-in-law, Henry Rozier, managing a bicycle manufacturing plant in Buffalo, New York. He decided to build his own motorized bicycles and call it motorcycles in the 1900s. He was the first in the nation with Indian following the next year and the Harley Davidson in 1902. By 1903, he decided to build a bigger automobile, and by 1907, he was asked by President Teddy Roosevelt of the United States to enter one of the race around New York City and ended in Paris. He sent word to the factory, and the next automobile, almost completed, was mounted with a gasoline engine. The entrance to the race was on. The Thomas Flyer, as it was called, won the race with the hired driver from Boston, where he went home and the company engineer took over driving across Japan, Siberia, Russia, and Paris.
Yeah, Edwin Thomas grew up in a family that used to do boating down the Ohio River to Mississippi. And if you read the history of him, he is quite the businessman. He helped build Memphis, Tennessee, banks, property, businesses. The interesting thing is I've read that he never once ever drove a car that he built. Never drove a car. They won that race, and he never gave the mechanic the money either, not for a few years. The next one is a Premier.
In 1903, the Premier automobile was built in Indianapolis, and it was a well-built car designed by George Wadley. He thought that his air-cooled engine was a much better engine. The Premier was the very first to use an emblem or to represent the company. It used an oak leaf medallion on the top of the radiator. The automobile company participated in 3 Glidden tours, that was a tour, and they had perfect scores in each. Sadly, the Premier autos didn't hold up in races like the Vanderbilt held in Long Island, New York.
We get the line now.
I'm trying to just, for the sake, I'm trying to just break it down just a bit.
Howard Marmon. His family owned a business. I consider myself a lot like Howard because I have bad allergies and I have hay fever. When Howard was a kid, they used to send him up on top of a mountain between the North Carolina-Tennessee border. He stayed there all summer long, then he went back. He started building automobiles, and when the Indy 500, when they announced it, he said to his chief race car driver, do you want to drive? And he says, no, I'm done driving. I'm not going to race anymore. So Howard Marmon told him, well, if you win, you get $25,000. He says, I'm in. So they built this Marmon Wasp, and the old story was that he put the mirror on it so he could see behind him and that he didn't need a mechanic. But he said it vibrated so much, it didn't really make a difference. But because he didn't have that mechanic and all the other drivers had mechanics, that meant they burnt more gas, they had to make more pit stops, and Howard Marmon's Marmon Wasp won. Ray Haroon. Haroon built his own car, started building his own car a few years after that. The second place finisher in that cried that it was false, and he said that he was cheated, that he took his time driving around the last lap because he said he won. But what they used to do is they used to go into the infield, and they would take and get their gas or tires changed. Then they would circle around and they'd go right back by for an extra lap. And the day of that first 500, there was so much dust and smoke. They said that the counters really couldn't count, and they were just estimating a lot of them. So, Carl Fisher, Prestolite. He's the one that built the Indy 500 track. He wanted a place that he could take his Started Dayton dealership and test drive the cars. Started Dayton has one up in the Seal Cove Museum up in Seal Cove, Maine, and they put organ pipes down the running board. And if they wanted to take and beep the horn, they threw a toggle switch and the exhaust went from the exhaust down the organ pipes and it played a tune. So John started from Dayton, Ohio. He jumped ship to go with Benjamin Briscoe, and that put him out of business. But before that, he made contributions to the city, schools, post office, you name it. He backed all the different businesses, built the library and everything else. A real strong guy, businessman. Now we come to the Studebakers. Most of you probably know the full story of Studebaker. The 5 Studebakers, basically none of them ever built an automobile. Not one. They were wagon builders. But John Moeller Studebaker, he went to California panning for gold, and he came back after 7 years. He had about $8,000 that he earned making wheelbarrows. They called him Wheelbarrow Johnny. He lived in a town in California just south of Lake Tahoe. And when he came back, 2 of his brothers more or less sold out to him and retired. And it seemed like one after the other started dying after that. But John Moeller's daughter married a Mr. Fish that was a lawyer from New Jersey that was personal friends with Thomas Edison. So Thomas Edison and him decided to electrify some of the cars. So they started out building electric cars. Then they bought a company in Garford Company in Ohio to build bodies, and the rest is history. Studebaker is actually one of the best companies because they had so many outlets to selling wagons and carriages. They built presidential carriages too. They had so many places to sell, and other companies didn't have that many dealers. So as soon as they built them, they were shipping them out and they were being sold. Studebaker was a good, solid company in America. They were Dutch. The Studebakers moved from Holland to middle of Pennsylvania to Huntington, where the museum is, and then from there to Ashland, Ohio, and then eventually to South Bend, Indiana. Yeah.
And they have a very nice museum in South Bend, Indiana, if you love Studebaker.
Henry Loja owned 3 bicycle factories. He lived in Cleveland. And his son, Henry Jr., they said, let's get rid of these bicycles and get in the automobile industry. So the Lojas started making boat racing engines in New York. And Henry, the father, moved to Plattsburgh, New York, right up near the Canadian border. And they told the 2 engineers to work and build something that they can build up there. So they built 2 steam cars. Well, the steam cars, he said, no, we're not going to build steam cars. He says internal combustion. So the 2 engineers took the steam boilers off and they put them on a boat and they packed all their furniture on and they moved up the St. Lawrence River to Plattsburgh. Instead of driving, they took it on their own boats. But they started building automobiles, and the Loja placed second in that first Indy 500. And the driver cried foul all the way. But Lojas were very good people. So what happened is, to build a car, there was a state senator from Albany that bought a brand new Mercedes and he ran into a tree. So they sent the engineers down and said, hey, look, we can fix your car for nothing or we'll buy it from you. So he says, no, fix it for nothing. So they took it up and they reversed engineered, took it apart. The Legg automobile was almost a carbon copy of the Mercedes, or the Benz. It was a Daimler then, before Benz, the Mercedes. And they started selling. And there was a Mr. Chandler that was a vice president of sales. He went over to Europe and he's selling them left and right. So they couldn't keep up with the sales. So they sold stock. When they sold stock, the stockholders all voted to move it to Detroit, Michigan. So Henry Legg sold his, the son sold his, and Chandler sold his stock, and he started his own company. We're going to get back to Chandler. A great story there. This is a Kissel car. Kissel was built by German family in Hartford, Wisconsin. Amelia Earhart bought a 1920-21 Kissel Gold Bug and drove it across country, racking up 7,000 miles, coming to Boston because her sister got accepted at Harvard University, and her father had an affair, so her mother and father divorced, so her mother came with her, 7,000 miles. The Kissel car was spelt with a K on both the Kissel and the car, and Mr. Kissel, the father of the boys, that he developed the town of Hartford, all types of different businesses he set up, including building houses. One unhappy guy walked in his real estate office and shot him dead, point blank. And I suggest you, if you're up near Milwaukee, go to Hartford to the Kissel Museum. This is the Mets, built in Waltham. They sold it in 17 installments. So you paid X amount of money, you get the first installment, you put it together, next week the next installment. And the good thing about the Mets is it was a cheap car. You built it yourself like Henry Ford. If he sent it to you and you had to put it together, Henry Ford said you could put your own Model T together in 2.5 hours. So Mets was a good car. The car behind it is the Alco, built by American Locomotive, right here in Providence, Pawtucket. And they built cars for, I think it was 7 years, 1905 to 1913 in Providence. The Alco was a very strong built, good automobile. The next one is the Mercer. Many of you have heard of the Mercer. It's considered America's first sports car. The Mercer was actually the Walter car downtown Manhattan. A Swiss candy maker that made chocolate candy, he took and he started building the Walter car. And he became good friends with Charles Roebling's son, Washington Roebling. And when he ran out of room to build his Walter car, Roebling's talked him into moving to Trenton, New Jersey, and now it's Roebling, New Jersey, because they changed the name, and that's where Charles Roebling invented wire rope. He was responsible for the Covington suspension bridge and then the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. So Washington Roebling, that designed this car, went on the Titanic. And when he was crossing the ocean, you all know the Titanic hit a iceberg, yeah, and it sank. And he was very instrumental because all the crew was jumping in the lifeboats. And he got the other men together to stop him and say, no, the women and older people go first, women and children and the older people. So his father went up to Nova Scotia to claim the body, and everybody commented how much of a hero his son really was. Okay, now we're at the Stutz beer car. I'm just going to tell you a real quick story about Harry Stutz, because most of you probably know the Stutz automobile was with the 32 valves and one of the most desired cars to have in a collection. Well, Harry Stutz's father was coming into Ellis Island from over in, it could have been Russia or it could have been Slovakia area. And he's standing in line and a couple in front asked him, who is sponsoring you? And he says, my uncle in Richmond, Indiana. And he says, oh, very good. Well, there's a young girl behind him about the same age, and he says, what do you mean sponsor? And they told her, well, if you don't have a sponsor, you're not going to be admitted. They're going to put you back on the boat and ship you back. Because you have to have somebody to put you up and make sure you learn the language so you can get a job and support yourself, not come in collect welfare. So Harry solved the problem. 20 minutes later, they were married, and they had Harry as the first child. He became a great engineer, and they lived happily ever after until their death do them apart. The next one is a Crane Simplex. Henry Crane went to MIT, local college right here in Cambridge. He built his car, and then he sold it to the Simplex. The wealthy people loved the Crane Simplex the Crane better than any car built. And when Simplex bought them out, they called it the Simplex Crane, but the people didn't. They called it the Crane Simplex. And MIT grad. Now, Charles Nash. Anybody know about Charles Nash that was abandoned as a 6-year-old boy? No? You all know Nash. Nash, I'll tell you a brief history of him. He was born in southwestern Illinois. His mother and father get divorced when he was 6 years old, and they abandoned him. So the local judge gave him to a farmer with some money and told the local farmer that he had to give him, feed him and clothe him. And he told little Charlie that he had to work doing chores to help support himself. So that farmer made him sleep in the barn, and he hired him out to all the other farms and collected money off him. When Charlie got to be 12 years old, he ran away and he started leasing himself out doing farm work. And he ended up in Flint, Michigan, working in the hardware store. Billy Durant and Dallas Dork, that owned the Durant Dork buggy company, couldn't believe how good of a worker he was, so they hired him to come in. He became the treasurer, became the #1 man there. And then when Durant got involved and took over Buick from being gone bankrupt, he brought Charlie Nash in to become the general manager of Buick. When John Storrow from the Boston Bank took over General Motors and kicked Billy Durant and all the other board of directors out, he was the third president. The first two were no names. John Storrow was the third president. He decided to move Charlie Nash, the one that had no schooling, up to president of General Motors. And he did such a good job, they paid off the loans in no time. But when Billy Durant came in with Chevrolet and, had that influence again, he wanted Charlie Nash to stay as president, but Charlie Nash knew that he could not survive with Billy Durant because he was a gambler and he just wanted to buy up all the competition, and that's what ran him out of business. So Charlie Nash became that first real president of General Motors. The next one is the Scripps Booth. The Scripps Booth, he was a comic writer. His family was in the newspaper business. So Jimmy Scripps Booth started writing comics, and then he decided to build an automobile. So he got in touch with William Stout, and they designed an automobile. And the first one, over on that table, there's a picture of the auto Bigo that Scripps Booth and William Stout built. And eventually William Stout went his way. Scripps Booth sold out to General Motors. General Motors, when Alfred Sloan came in, he discontinued the Scripps Booth car. And William Stout went to Ford, and he helped him build the tri-motor airplanes. And then before that, or maybe after, I'm not sure, it's very close, he built the Stout Scarab, which I have pictures over there on that table. Next one up is a DuPont. This is E. Paul DuPont, not the DuPont that owned General Motors stock. This was a cousin, and he actually bought the Indian Motorcycle Factory, and he built the last DuPont Speedsters in that factory. He made his money from the explosives. The other DuPont was making his, I believe, from paints and chemicals. So DuPont, he bought that Indian Motorcycle Company, and he built these beautiful cars. In 1932, he stopped building them. And if you go to the Greenwich Concours d'Elegance, usually you will get to see a DuPont because there's family members that still have DuPonts, and Wayne Carini is the gentleman that restored the DuPont cars. He does a very good job. Next one up is Lincoln. Now, you heard the story that Henry Leland went into Detroit Automobile Company, And he took it over because the investors wanted Leland to take over control of the warehouse and build it, and told Henry to go sit in his office and keep inventing parts. So Henry didn't like that. So in 1718, Henry Leland left General Motors Cadillac division because they didn't want to support the war. In 1918, he left to build the Liberty engine for the war. So he built Lincoln Motors in Detroit. And sadly, well, I guess it's really good that the war ended rather quickly. And he had invested all this money in the machinery, and he only got X amount of motors built, but the government canceled the contracts. So Lincoln now didn't have really the money coming in to sustain the building of anything. Well, his daughter married a guy, and Henry Leland put him in charge of ordering the bodies for the cars. And he didn't know what he was doing, and the bodies showed up 4 months after the auto shows, and that really put them out of business. But Henry Ford went to auction, bought Lincoln Motor Company, the building, all the assets, everything for $8.5 million. And through the goodness of his heart, all the different suppliers that were owed money by Lincoln Motors, he paid off in the fullest. He says he doesn't think because Lincoln was poorly managed that the suppliers should suffer. So Henry Leland wanted to take and have Ford pay off all the investors that bought stock. And Ford said absolutely not. Even Clara Ford and Edsel Ford tried to talk their father into helping out Henry Leland because they liked him. But Henry didn't. He had that grudge because he came into Detroit Auto and took over that business. You okay? Have a drink. Okay, next up is the Jordan automobile. Real quick, Ned Jordan. He lived out in Wyoming in a trading post. His father served in a Civil War. And I'm not sure whether he was drunk or he just got lost. But he abandoned the family. Ned Jordan had 3 sisters and a mother, and she ran a trading post on the Oregon Trail. And he decided when he was 15 years old, he was going to move back to Milwaukee. And he moved back and he got a job in a Milwaukee newspaper. And Teddy Roosevelt came in on a train, and all the newspaper reporters wanted to get an interview, and they wouldn't let anybody near the train. So Ned went in the mechanic's room and he took an old, the jumpsuit, put it on, and he told the security who was maintenance that he had to go in because that's his job. They let him in. He interviewed Teddy Roosevelt. He came out and he told everybody that he got an interview with Teddy Roosevelt. If they wanted a copy, it's $10 and it'll be ready in the morning at 6 or 7 in the morning. And he went back to the printing company where he worked and he ran them off. And he made supposedly close to $2,000. And he quit the job and he went to University of Wisconsin and became the head marketing. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the greatest marketing advertisement of automobiles ever, somewhere west of Laredo, with a pretty blonde girl riding a horse and the Jordan car riding beside. But 2 things that I want to tell you about the Jordan. One is he told his sales crew, look, if a couple comes in, don't waste your time talking to the man. He says, talk to the wife. Tell the wife how beautiful she'll look when you go to the big celebration and you step out in your beautiful gown and everybody says, look at this beautiful lady stepping out of the most beautiful car, because he used bright colors. So one thing that Ned Jordan did, and you're probably gonna all laugh at this, he invited all the workers. They closed the factory on a Sunday, and he invited them all to come to a picnic field day for workers. He told them, bring your wives and your children. He says, they're going to have a ball. But if you don't want to come, you don't have to. He says, but it's going to be your loss. So they had pony rides. They had barbershop quartet. They had magicians. They had all kinds of things to do. So he encouraged his workers to walk with him and introduce the wife to Mr. Jordan. And when Mr. Jordan met the wife, he shook the hand and he pulled out of his pocket an envelope and he gave it to her. And he says, this is for you. And she says, well, what is it? And he says, go ahead, open it. and there was anywhere from $200 to $250 in cash in it. And she says, "What's this for?" And he says, "That's for being a loyal family member. You get your husband up and you get him fed and you get him off to work. He's always to work on time. He's never late." Basically what he did, he just bought the loyalty from the wives to push their husbands out the door. Okay. This is the Hudson. I know you all know Hudson. This is the Hudson Hornet. Real quick, Hudson built a fabulous car. They named it after Joe Hudson that owned Hudson department stores in Michigan. And the reason why they named it after him, because he had an unbelievable reputation of being the best businessman. If you bought something and 2 years later it broke, you bring it back, he would replace it, no questions asked. He was never married, but his niece was Eleanor Ford that was married to Edsel Ford, and his other niece was married to a vice president that started Hudson Motors. And I'm not going to get real deep into Hudson, but if you ever watched that Cars movie with your grandchildren, the Doc with the Hudson, the Piston Cup winner, well, that's the car. Yeah, they won something like 47 out of 52 NASCAR races in the early 50s. To go real quick, we're back to Chrysler. Walter Chrysler opened up the Plymouth dealership, and Plymouth basically saved. One of the last shows that I did the number 1, 2, and 3 sellers through the Depression. Plymouth saved Chrysler. They were always the third most popular selling automobile during the Depression age. In the Dodge pickups, the Graham brothers grew up down in Western Indiana. This is a great story. They grew up in Western Indiana, and the oldest one worked in a glass factory, and they were making glass bottles. But the problem, when you took the glass bottle off the machine after it was blown, the shoulders of it broke. So he decided to do it just the opposite, have it upside down. So that's what they did, is they poured it upside down, and it became successful. He became part owner of it, the Graham brothers, and they sold out to a man from Cambridge. What's the name of the insulation company? The big one, Owens Corning. Owens Corning. Sold it out to a Mr. Owens from Charlestown, and Owens ended up joining Corning Glass to become one company. So they started buying they were buying the chassis off of Ford Motor Company, and then they were putting bodies on for Dodge, selling them to Dodge. And 2 of the Graham brothers were actually vice presidents at Dodge Motor Company when the wives owned it. Because Horace and John Dodge, John died first because Horace got the flu, influenza, in 1919, and John wouldn't leave his side. So he took and he stayed in the room, and Horace got better, and he left the hospital, but in the meanwhile, John got the influenza and ended up dying, and Horace was so sad and depressed over it, he drank himself to death, and he was dead by 1920. They both died in 1920. So the 2 wives took it over, and they hired good help to run Dodge Motor Company. Now, Walter Chrysler wanted Dodge Motor Company because he had them doing all their foundry work, making parts, different parts for the Chrysler. And when he paid, they sold it to an investment group in New York for $146 million. And Walter Chrysler bought it for $174 million. And he was asked before, because it almost put him out of business in 1929. And he said, no, he says, actually, it saved the company. He says, because we couldn't afford to buy the parts if somebody else had bought it. So he ended up buying Dodge. But the Graham brothers built this, and you might wonder what happened to the Graham brothers. They bought the Page company, turned it into the Graham Page, dropped the Page, and then they sold that after they did the government contracts. And this is going to surprise you. The Graham brothers took and bought Madison Square Garden, the New York Knicks, and the hockey team, and they were making money, and then they sold it to Gulf Western. And the DeSoto was another company started in 1927 by Walter Chrysler. He wanted a lot, well, I think he wants to get a picture of it, I'm sorry. All set? So then you got Walter Chrysler, and he took over that Maxwell company, and he's going to tie in with the next story I'm going to tell you. In 1923-24, he changed it from Maxwell to Chrysler, and the rest is history. He built the Chrysler Tower, riding high on top of the hill. Now I got two more that I want to tell you. One, you might want to wait because we're almost done. 2 minutes, we're going to be done. There was a man named Ralph Tita. Ralph Tita was born in 1890, and when he was 5 years old, he was playing with a jackknife. He threw it up in the air, it came down and went right to his eye socket. He cut one of the nerves, but the problem was he got a disease in the eyes from that, and he went totally blind, could not see. When he was 12 years old, he had his cousin come live with him for 2 weeks. They went out and found 2 bicycles and a lawnmower, and they built a little car that went 5 miles per hour. He graduated from high school at 14 years old, won a 5-year study scholarship to University of Pennsylvania Engineering School. He went and graduated in a year less. I got it. And once he graduated, we were entering World War I, and the U.S. Navy was trying to add steam power to the sailing ships so they didn't have to depend on all wind. So every time they got the steam engines going and they put it in gear, the drive shaft slowly would start vibrating worse and worse and worse, and then the drive shafts would snap. So the engineers couldn't figure out what it was, but they said this one smart young guy from University of Pennsylvania, if anybody can figure it out, he can. So they took him down to Philadelphia, actually it was Camden Yards, and they took him in, the ship was in dry dock, and he says, go ahead, start it up, build the pressure. And so they did, and as soon as they put it in gear, he says, your propellers aren't perfectly balanced. And he taught him how to balance the propellers. He went to work for him for a while. Then he started his own company with his family called Perfect Circle Industries, which are piston replacement rings. And in 1923-24, he invented the first fluid drive automatic transmission. And he sold it to the Bendix company, and Walter Chrysler put it in, I think it was 1925, Chrysler was the first one to have an automatic transmission. After World War II, he's riding with his lawyer, and his lawyer's driving along. When he talks, he slows down, but when he listens, he speeds up. He's doing this to him, making him car sick. So he took and invented cruise control, the way we have it, not the throttle lock. In the old cars, you Model Ts can pull the throttle out and lock it, and it's like cruise control. So anyways, he got nominated into the Automobile Hall of Fame in Dearborn. And when he was there, they listed all his inventions, all his accomplishments. And newspaper guy went up to him after, and he says, sir, can I ask you a few questions? He said, sure, what do you want to know? And he says, what do you think is your greatest accomplishment? He says, you've accomplished so much. And he laughed at him. And he says, well, if I tell you, you're not going to believe me. And he says, well, what is it? He says, I own a company with over 375 employees, and not one of them knows that I'm completely blind. And he says, really? And he says, yeah. And then he told him how when he threw the knife up, his parents told him, Ralph, you did this to yourself. You're not going to get any sympathy. You're going to have to polish up your hearing and your memory. It's the only way you're going to make it through life. And that's what he did. So the newspaper guy, he thought it was the greatest story. And he says, you're going to print that? And he says, yes, I am. And he says, let me tell you. He says, a problem with a handicapped child one born handicapped or one that develops it, the mother and father always say, my little Johnny or Mary can't compete against your children because he has this handicap or she has a handicap. And what you're doing is you're taking any positive thoughts away from that child. So you have to always be positive that you can do anything. Even though a 3-foot can't dunk a basketball, but I mean, you can do just about anything else. Okay, the other story, this is the last story. This is a Chandler. I told you the Lozier company, Mr. Chandler, that went to Europe and sold all those Mercedes. Well, he did the same style of building the Chandler car in Ohio. So they were selling unbelievable. So he had a 7-day operation, 24 hours a day, and instead of hiring extra mechanics to walk back and forth and get the parts, he took and he hired younger kids, 17, 18, to go to the railroad dock and the warehouse where they kept them and carry them into the different workstations. And once they distributed them, well, this one boy or young guy named Leslie thought, if we take, and instead of bringing X amount of parts, we bring 4 times as much, then we got 2 hours we can kill. So they found out that the boss had a new dictaphone machine in his office. So they went in and they started practicing barbershop quartet. And they used to sing and then play it back, and then they could tell how they sounded. Well, one night they forgot to shut it off. And not only did they forget, but one of them says the boss is a real idiot because he doesn't know how easy it is for them to find an extra 2-3 hours every night to use a dictaphone to sing. So the boss hired 4, next morning he heard it, he hired 4 or 5 to replace him. And he waited, and when they went into his office, he opened the door and said, it shouldn't surprise you why you're terminated, now get off the property. Kicked him out. So Leslie went home and he told his mother, he had moved from England to the Cleveland area. He says, I'm sorry I got fired. And she says, well, you're going to have to get another job. And his brother says, well, he says, you can work with me. He says, I'm cutting down some trees. And he says, I could use you. So he says, all right. So the next day they went out and he told Leslie to shimmy out this branch as far as he could, sitting on it like a horse. So when he cuts a tree, instead of falling towards a house, that extra weight will make it go that way. Well, he's sitting on the branch, all of a sudden he goes upside down and he falls flat on his face, and he destroyed his facial bones, and they had to all be reconstructed. So then Leslie, with this guy named George, decided to go into vaudeville acts and paint their face black and make fun of people. And finally his manager said to him, Leslie, you don't have to make fun of black people to make a living. What you can do is you can get some good one-line jokes, and you can don't put any makeup on, and just tell one-line jokes. He says, with your face being so funny looking, he says, people are going to laugh. So he did, but he says, there's one thing, you're going to have to change your name. Leslie isn't an entertaining name. So he changed it to? Bob Hope. Yes, Bob Hope, the greatest. And I just wanted to finally tell you, I have business cards up here. You can take a business card if you want. If you have any questions, if you want me to research anything, because I got over 400 books in my collection, and I would say 7,000 magazines. But this is a painting I bought the rights to because the book that I've been writing for 18 years in the history of the automobile, it's going to be 3 volumes. I bought the rights to this to use as a cover. And on the front, if you look at it, it's got a 1890s brass age vehicle and with a horse-drawn wagon. And that's it.
One question.
Sure.
So Mossberg, you did a whole a chapter on Mossberg, right?
Oh, yes, I forgot. Frank Mossberg. Yeah. Okay, real quick. Frank Mossberg, I don't need to read anything. Frank Mossberg he invented the micrometer. He invented the roller bearings that they use in the Panama Canal, and the gates have the same roller bearings now, over 100 years later. He invented the bicycle bell that you put on the thing and you go ding, ding. He invented the siren for for the Coast Guard. They used to bring them out and put them in the lighthouse because when it was foggy, they used the siren that he invented. It was called the devil whistle. It was a whistle that kids could blow, and I guess it was a bad noise. But he sold so many of them in the country, a devil whistle, that he actually made more money off that than anything else. He invented the 12-point wrench set and socket set. Before they were either 6 or 4 for the, yeah. He made 3 electric cars. He built roughly 20 cars, gasoline engine for internal combustion engine for a company in New York. And some gentleman, he left, he was saying that he lived next door and he could hear the stamping, the big loud bang, his stamping company. And that was making the socket sets. His grandson is Chester Vanderpyle that lives in Florida in his 80s. And you might like the story. I drove down to the Villages, and he lives on the coast, and he told me that I'd meet him at a Burger King. So I went to the Burger King, and he brings in 2 suitcases filled with tools. And he had original, never used ratchet wrenches. He built all the Model T wrench sets for the Model Ts. And if you have it, it'll say Ford, but you flip it over and you see a diamond with an M in the middle. That's Mossberg. He made it. When Henry Ford, I believe, once he got the River Rouge plant, he probably made his own tool sets too. It probably, in fact, I'm sure he did. So, but Frank Mossberg, he had 2 sons and a daughter. The 2 sons died right after birth. The daughter married this Vanderpyle, and Vanderpyle at one time worked at Texas Instrument. And he went to work for Fram because the Fram filters, they had the cardboard around and it got real soggy and it would just collapse and, you know, it wasn't a good filter. So he designed the one that's a zigzag inside. When you look inside the filter, the cardboard is like this. And that made it stronger, so once it was soaked with oil, it didn't. He lived at 137 Pleasant Street. So if you go down North Main Street, you come to Forest Street, the very next house, it's an apartment house, that's where he lived. He had 2 factories. He met Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. His grandson told me that he took and slept in a cottage behind Henry Ford's and Thomas Edison's winter cottages down in Fort Myers. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's about it. Thank you.